I saw this video a while back and wanted to react to it. And I discovered that on YouTube you can do that. The video is titled "The Main Reason Why Germany Lost World War II, Oil." And it's by TIKHistory. Pretty good channel. I've watched a couple of the fellow's episodes, and I mean, sometimes he kind of goes off the rails, but he certainly makes a point of backing up what he's claiming with sources, which is nice. And let's just see how it goes.
If Hitler had not invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, he would likely have never got another chance. People keep saying that the Germans should have produced more panzers, they should have produced more planes, or produced more submarines. People can't understand why Hitler allows the British to withdraw from Dunkirk, or why his generals call him mad for ordering his men to stand fast and fight to the death when he has so little manpower, even though these are actually strategically sound decisions given the circumstances. Why did Germany have to invade the Soviet Union in 1941? Why was their army marching on foot instead of riding in trucks? Why?
Okay, it's not exactly a promising beginning, because mechanization was a thing, certainly, but almost all armies were still basically not mechanized. In 1939, not even the United States. So, but anyway, let's move on.
Why are they reliant on horses? It's all related to the same question. Why did Germany and the Axis powers lose World War II? And it can all be summed up with just one word: oil.
Really strong beginning, though. I mean, I got to give him credit for that. It's a very strong. I'm going to make a case, and I'm going to put every possible effort into strengthening that case and so forth. But
let's find out why. Few people seem to realise just how severe the oil crisis was for the Axis in World War II. World War II has been described by one academic historian as the first war for oil. When you study World War II, you should have the oil crisis in the back of your mind, because that is how important it is. And we'll find out exactly why in this video. Oil.
No. I mean, that's really overstating your case. Germany was a resource-poor country, so there were tons of resources it didn't have and it wanted to acquire. Oil was one of them, but just about any resource you want to pick on, they needed.
Oil is not the only factor, but oil is the most important one, and it's what dooms the Axis to defeat in World War II. That's not to say they didn't have a chance of victory, but oil...
Okay, here we've got, well, I mean, they might have won anyway, so the lack of oil, which was never resolved, by the way, isn't quite as deterministic as the intro suggests.
Oil is a massive problem for Germany, who's relying on Blitzkrieg or Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, to win its wars. It's also the reason that, after the war, Britain is no longer a superpower, and the Soviet Union and the United States are, although that's a topic for another day. Germany was reliant on imports, and the oil producers during the 1930s were essentially the United States, Venezuela, and the Soviet Union, the nations that Hitler would wage war against or would not be able to trade with when war broke out. In Europe, Romania is the largest exporter of crude oil, but even combined with German output, as well as the rest of the European output, like Hungary, this is simply not enough to meet European demand. In fact, Romanian oil production had sunk from 8.7 million tonnes in 1936 to 5.2 million tonnes in 1941, partly due to political reasons. So Romania isn't really a reliable source of oil. The quick victories in 1939 and 1940 produced a massive energy crisis in Germany. When the French surrender, Britain decides to keep fighting. This means that imports from outside of Europe cease thanks to the British blockade.
Yes, but the Soviet Union was providing everything at that stage, including oil. So the blockade wasn't going to work. That was the whole point of the Nazi-Soviet pact, is that, well, you know what, it overcomes the resource limitations that Britain could impose.
Germany's domestic oil production, synthetic or otherwise, now suddenly has to meet the demands of not only Germany itself, but all the countries it's just conquered. This was really bad news. Germany and a sphere of influence consumed 9,558,000 tonnes more oil than it produced. And this was in 1940. Britain, wooed to the last moment, had declared war on him, placing him in a position of strategic and economic dependence on the state whose annihilation was the central objective, the Soviet Union.
Okay, so he's actually accepted that. So let's just see where he goes.
Drastic measures were introduced in May of 1941 to curb oil consumption, and these were ordered by Hitler himself. These were so severe that in 1941, Economics Minister Walter Funk said that the economy was receiving less than 18% of its peacetime oil quantities. But it isn't enough, and even more cuts to the civilian economy followed. These cuts were so extensive that British Air Ministry observers secretly referred to them in early 1942 as the severest form of rationing.
Okay, fair enough. Haven't checked that source, but I'm willing to go along with the claim that Germany was under severe economic pressure from oil. But let's see about the realities of this, right? I mean, yes, Germany was short on oil, but it was still quite capable of conducting the war that it intended at this point.
But it still isn't enough, and the German army is affected. In February of 1941, Goering is warned by General de Infantry Georg Thomas, head of the War Economy and Armaments Office, that fuel reserves would only last about 2 months during operational consumption, i.e.
Okay, let's keep that in mind. Only last for 2 months. But the war went on for years and the Luftwaffe was still operating. Don't know.
During an offensive. On the 8th of March 1941, Keitel was also warned by Georg Thomas that existing supplies of petroleum would run out in the middle of August, or in the autumn. In March of 1941, General Erdhard Wagner, the Army Quartermaster General, gave an equally gloomy prognosis to Halder, informing him that once Germany lost its imports from the Soviet Union, existing stocks were only sufficient for 2 months of large-scale offensive consumption. Rommel has one eye on the petrol gauge at all times because the Italian fleet hasn't got enough oil to ship more oil across to him. In fact, the Italian fleet is sat in harbour throughout the war through lack of oil. In May 1941, Georg Thomas again says Germany will run out of oil in late October 1941. In late May 1941, General Adolf von Schell, the man responsible for the motor vehicle industry, seriously suggested that in light of the chronic shortage of oil, it would be advisable to carry out a partial demotorization of the Wehrmacht. At this stage, the German army has 10 motorized and 20 Panzer divisions at this stage. Out of 151 divisions.
Exactly. Out of 151 divisions, only 30 are mechanized. That cuts your oil consumption quite a bit. Now, as a result, you need horses. A lot of horses. But they did have horses, and they certainly took horses from anywhere they could to sustain that. And those can live off the land.
Aimed at the Soviet Union. Yet here was the leading general of the motor industry seriously suggesting that they reduce this number even further. As a result of the fuel crisis, the Wehrmacht was forced to rely extensively on horse-drawn transport, which led...
Oh, okay. The Wehrmacht depended on horse-drawn transport precisely because most of it was still horse-drawn. That includes artillery for infantry, that includes supply trains. Really not a valid statement to say that somehow or other that was forced on them. They had a limit. They certainly were not in a position to mechanize their entire army with the constraints on oil that existed, but they certainly could continue to operate the forces that they had. Technical point.
Led to further problems. The tremendous difficulties in the pace of march between the motorised and other units raised the issue of when and how to close pockets.
Sure, but that was a problem that existed just as much in France, and it wasn't a function of a lack of oil. It was a function of the German army was kind of two armies. There was a mechanized army and there was a traditional army that would have been recognizable to somebody from World War I, with a leadership that very much had a World War I perspective.
Horse-drawn columns were vulnerable to attacks that...
Yeah, okay, and so are gasoline-powered trucks, and so are trains, and that's overstating, to say the least.
Aggravated logistic problems, and the lack of fodder and replacement animals put a strain on...
Yeah, well, that wasn't as big a problem because the fodder was collected locally, and in that sense it was very much the same as any other army of that period. Food for the animals didn't have to be transported. You basically took it from the locals, which of course aggravated relations with locals, but that's what they did.
Civilian supplies. If they do nothing, the Germans and the Axis powers in Europe will lose their ability to strike. They either have to find peace with Britain or find oil elsewhere. There is an attempt to get more oil from Romania in the March of 1941 when Goering meets with Romanian dictator Antonescu in Vienna to discuss the raising of oil production in Romania. Goering also forms the Continental Oil AG in 1940 and 41, which was essentially a Central European fuel company that aims to get as much oil as possible. It secured the Romanian oil fields for Germany by buying out Belgian and French-owned oil companies in Romania, controlling 23% of the oil production in Romania by the spring of 1942. But Romanian oil could only really go so far, and peace with Britain now seemed remote. What option was left for Germany in late 1940 and 41? They could take the Middle East, but again, the oil industry there is in its infancy, and the British are not extracting much oil from it themselves.
Okay, that's just crazy. This is very old arguments that have been made. The Germans should have gone into Africa in a big way and conquer the oil that was yet to be discovered in Africa, or just, run through the entire, all of Central Asia, and, that's okay. Let's just skip this.
Plus, how would the Germans get that oil back to Germany to be refined? It's just not practical. So, unless he wants to watch his war machine and economy collapse, there's really only one viable option to Mr. Hitler at this stage. The occupied territories would drain Germany's meagre petroleum reserves within a year unless the Third Reich took immediate action to expand its supplies by invading the Soviet Union.
That's important. That's an important statement, because effectively what is being stated here is that Germany needs more oil from the Soviet Union, or everybody in occupied Europe runs out of oil in a year. This being stated as pre-invasion 1941, so that should be 1942. But we know that didn't happen because the Germans were still fighting in 1945. Anyway.
On the 31st of July 1940, Hitler decides that the attack on the Soviet Union is going to happen. Some have said that Germany should have done one of several other options, like smashing the British in the Middle East or concentrating on the U-boat war, but it's clear, at least in Hitler's mind, that there's a time limit going on.
This isn't about a time limit, and a lot of people make this point about, it's a very British-centric or Western-centric perspective, that taking the British Islands was somehow or other going to benefit Germany. I mean, I'm not really sure how that was going to work out. The power of the British Empire was literally the empire, and that empire was scattered all over the world, and none of it was anywhere near Germany, and Germany did not have a navy that could stand up to the British, much less the British, Americans, and others. So, no, I don't think Hitler was ever really interested in destroying the British Empire. And I mean, there's sources that at least hint that that's the case. So, kind of dicey here as far as I'm concerned. But let's move on.
At the Berghof on the 9th of January 1941, Hitler says that smashing the Soviet Union would represent a great relief to Germany and to Japan. After Russia's destruction, Germany would be unassailable. Russia's expanses contained immeasurable wealth. Germany must dominate them economically and politically, but not annex them.
Very important point here. Hitler's not exactly wrong about this. If he defeats the Soviet Union and gets access to its resources, the GDP imbalance with the British in particular is enormous. I mean, it was already kind of hopeless after France was defeated, but with the Soviet Union gone, Germany actually is close to being able to stand up to the British and the Americans combined. So, kind of right.
Plus, she would have all the potential for waging war, even against continents in the future. He needs Soviet oil, and his eyes are on the Caucasus.
He needs Soviet resources generally. That is food, oil, minerals of various sorts, just everything. All right. So it's not about the oil. It's about the resources as a whole in the Soviet Union that, when you add it all up, becomes a really important resource. But then so are the people, and of course Nazism is going to destined to undermine whatever goodwill liberating various ethnic groups from the Soviet Union was providing them. But that's a totally different argument. So, about the oil.
It is crucial to seize quickly and exploit the Caucasus oil fields, at least the areas around Maykop and Grozny.
Yeah, sure, it would be nice. But that's, again, let's have a look here. It's March 1941 that this is being talked about, and it's a flight of fancy of it would be nice to have that. Yeah, sure, because then the German and German occupied Europe and its allies have enough oil. If they have the oil fields in the Caucasus, they've got enough oil.
In oil fields that have not yet been completely destroyed, it will take about a month to resume production and another month for its transport. We will have to seize those areas no later than the end of the operation's second month.
That's fantasy. And planning for the invasion of the Soviet Union certainly doesn't suggest any timetable that suggests that. This is more an argument as to why we should not go to war with the Soviet Union. And believe me, there were more than one general who certainly had their doubts about doing this.
This proved unsuccessful. We must expect the most serious repercussions with unpredictable consequences for military operations after the 1st of September 1941 and for the survival of the economy.
Okay, so what we've got here is clearly a prediction that was wrong, since Germany certainly kept up. Not only past September 1941, it kept up until May 1944, 45. Although the last year is kind of, but...
The 1st of September 1941. This is the date that Germany has to win by. If it doesn't win by early September, the Germans will suffer big time. Why does Hitler invade the Soviet Union when he does? Because June 1941 is the latest the Germans can actually invade. Why not earlier? Rainy season, Balkans, Russian winter in 1940-41, just to name a few issues. But there is an argument to say, well, he could have invaded a few weeks earlier, and that's fine. But the point is that the summer of 1941 is the last time Germany has the option to invade because of the oil crisis. Britain's...
No. I mean, it's a plan. It's a huge plan involving millions of people and a complicated string of logistical decisions. So it'll take time to organize, and certainly that would be why they were only ready in 1941. I mean, it takes time to organize and move everything. It's an amazing fact that it came as a surprise, even though there was lots of indications that the Germans were building up along the frontier with the Soviet Union. The actual attack still ended up coming as a surprise. But anyway, let's move on.
His decision to keep on fighting in 1940 forces this on Germany. The blockade prevents German imports of oil, starving the Axis of the means to fight. This is what triggers Germany to invade the Soviet Union and sets a time limit to that invasion. And
that's just unrealistic here, because if you remember back a little bit earlier in this video, it's accepted that the Soviet Union was providing the Germans with oil. And they were providing enough that obviously the German war effort against, I guess, Britain and the Commonwealth was sustainable. without any questions or problems. So there's no time limit because the Soviets are providing the oil. And the British blockade is having the nil effect that you would expect if you've got a back door that feeds you everything you need, including food, including food and resources of various sorts. And the Germans, interesting side note, failed to deliver their promised deliveries to the Soviet Union on a fairly routine basis, and nobody ever complained. So, and it's understandable because the whole France, one of the great powers and considered stronger than Germany in 1939, was gone in 6 weeks. So the Germans were doing something right, and let's not antagonize them, I guess, was the mindset of the decision makers in the Soviet Union.
Either way, Germany invades the Soviet Union in 1941 with the goal of keeping this to a short war. It has to be short because they only have enough oil to fight it for a few months.
No, it has to be short because it has to be short because the longer the war goes on, the more it becomes a war of attrition, and the Germans could not possibly win a war of attrition against the Soviet Union or the British Empire, which were capable of bringing in far larger resources. So one of those countries has to disappear and basically be absorbed by Germany in order for victory. So it's never the case. It was never the case that anyone, I think, in the planning of the invasion of the Soviet Union, had any flights of fancy that a long war could be won. They were on a tight schedule to do something very specific, and if they did it, they could continue on, and they would have the resources, right? So theoretically, they would have a reasonable chance of actually defeating or making their defeat implausible.
The oil crisis dictates that Germany must win and take the Caucasus in 2 months, otherwise their army will be rendered.
No, it doesn't. I mean, again, that's speculation from March 1941, and 2 months from the end of June is July and August. So end of August 1941, they have to take the Caucasus or they lose. Well, that doesn't seem to be what actually happened in any way. So somebody's wrong.
Ineffective. They must either knock out the Soviets completely, force their collapse or surrender, or crush the Red Army and then take the oil before the Soviets have time to recover. This is why going to Moscow in 1941 is wrong. This is why taking on Leningrad is kind of irrelevant. This is why Guderian is turned south to help Army Group South, which does in fact go into the Caucasus briefly in 1941 and is forced back. It's because Germany needs to get to the oil. The reason Barbarossa is designed to be a short, sharp campaign to wipe the Soviets out at the border and then ride off into victory is because of the oil shortage. It's not because of the limited manpower. It's
Wow. Okay. No. The reason the logic here was to take Moscow. There's no question about that. That was the plan, right? It's like in the south you have an attack that's meant to hold the forces there. In the north you have an attack that's meant to hold the forces there, and in the center you have a direct line into Moscow. I mean that's the plan, and the logic, is pretty straightforward. It's intended to do exactly what what the Germans did in France, which is that, I mean, how can I put this simply? They disrupted the government and caused mass demoralization as a consequence. That's blitzkrieg in a sentence. The goal is to destroy the continuation of government authority. And all you need is a little bit of a disruption. So I'm not sure what the rationale is for making this claim. It's the rush to, and the August thing is a huge story in and of itself. But you know, let's focus on the oil. So we'll just go on here. But I mean, that's pretty questionable, to say the least. So let's continue.
It's not because they can't replace tanks, they actually can replace tank numbers, as shown in a previous video. The Germans have more tanks in 1942 than in 1941, and more tanks in 1943 than in 1942. The problem is that they can't run the tanks they already have beyond the autumn of 1941. Barbarossa is designed to crush the Red Army, then win. And there's no backup plan if this
Disrupt the government, causing about the collapse of the army or resistance in the army. It's like it's a technical point, but it actually is significant because that's what makes Moscow significant. Is take Moscow, take the government out, force a disruption of the government, and everything else will just sort of crumble. That's the assumption. Whether or not that's true is a totally different question. Nobody knows because it didn't happen.
It doesn't happen because it's do or die time. There's little to no mention about Soviet reserves because the Germans are hoping that they don't have any. If they do have reserves, they're not going to get the resources needed to fight them. It's interesting because according to Starhill, the first plans of Operation Barbarossa do not even factor in Soviet reserves at all. Paulus is the first to say, actually, the Soviets will probably have another 100 divisions behind the frontier troops. People say Paulus was a passive commander or bad commander, and I'll come back to that at a later date. But for Barbarossa, he was on the ball. Unfortunately, for the Germans and for Paulus, it wasn't 100 reserve divisions, it was more like 300, although many were not anywhere near their full strength. But the Germans don't really have much choice. If they don't win in 2 months, their army won't be able to win because their main weapon, their panzers, won't have enough fuel to win. So
okay, but we know from actual history that obviously the panzers just kept working, right? So something's wrong with this argument because they supposedly are out of oil in 2 months, but you know, the whole drive south after Smolensk happened, and they continue to attack in the Moscow direction after they've carried out that battle. So something's wrong with this argument.
it has to be a short campaign, and it has to be waged in 1941.
Well, it doesn't have to be waged in 1941, but it's certainly an opportune time. Yeah, I don't know.
Overy states that in 1941 Hitler made the mistake of invading the Soviet Union in the belief that the tactics of lightning war would bring about victory in 4 months.
Now let's think about that, all right? Basically, if you're going with the German plan is pinning troops in the north, in the areas of Army Group North and South, and pushing into Moscow with Army Group Center. They hit Smolensk in July. They've cleared it sometime in August. And they're basically held up then until, is it September? End of September, something like that. bottom line is that they give time for the Soviets to build up new reserves in front of Moscow and build defenses again. Crash through them. Oh, this is just annoying. Crash through them again. And call it off in December. You can pretty much guess that, yeah, theoretically, if they just kept going towards Moscow, 4 months is what they needed. But let's move on.
Why 4 months? They started on the 22nd of June, so July, August, September, October when they ran out of oil. It wasn't the invasion of the Soviet Union that was the problem, it was the fact that they hoped to win the war in just 4 months.
Which was doable. But according to the history, they'd reach Moscow in 4 months. They could do that, apparently. And the other side of this is that there's this emphasis being made here that somehow or other that the Germans could somehow or other not possibly win in that time frame, and they'd run out of oil and be defeated. But the history says otherwise. They certainly weren't defeated in 1941. They were given a bloody nose in December into March of 1942, but they certainly weren't defeated. So history says they did, well, whatever impact oil had, it certainly wasn't capable of defeating the Germans if they couldn't win in 4 months. Here we go.
If you read Guderian, you will know that Hitler's decision to turn south during Barbarossa cost the Germans the time needed to take Moscow.
Yeah, pretty much. And as a matter of fact, the German leadership, military leadership, was adamantly opposed to not following the plan. You can actually see the bureaucratic side of that by looking at the directives. I think it's Directive 34 and 30, which was out in July, middle of July, saying it's like, now that Smolensk has been defeated, we want to move forces south. And then all of a sudden, surprisingly, the German generals had to resupply things and so forth because they were intent on bullying Hitler into accepting the idea of following the plan as it had been laid out.
This was often seen as a mistake. No, it wasn't.
No, it was a mistake.
If Germany succeeds in taking Moscow, that is obviously a grave disappointment for us. But it by no means disrupts our grand strategy. Germany would gain accommodation, but that alone will not win the war. The only...
Okay, yeah, well, that's Timoshenko talking in November 1941. You know, that's kind of debatable since, the Soviet Union's reliance on oil was equally limited because most of their army wasn't mechanized either. But it's a feel-good message intended to point up, and let's keep in mind economic determinism is pretty much what the Soviet Union was all about, and its political leadership saw everything in terms of economic determinism, which was why they had most of the forces in the forward areas deployed in the south, protecting the Ukraine and what was behind the Ukraine, rather than the road to Moscow. But you have to wonder whether that was going to turn out to be feasible if the government was forced to withdraw from Moscow. Anyway.
The only thing that matters is oil. As we remember, Germany kept harping on about her own urgent oil problems in her economic bargaining with us from 1939 to 1941. So we have to do all we can, A, to make Germany increase her oil consumption, and B, to keep the German armies out of the Caucasus.
Well, they certainly, that's just, okay, so what? I don't see how that moves forward. I mean, it's Timoshenko's basically speaking to an audience that pretty much buys into whatever he's going to say. And it's a feel-good statement, right? It's like, well, I mean, they're pretty far from the Caucasus, and we must keep them from the Caucasus, and so forth. It's kind of reading Hitler's mind, in a sense, but he's certainly not reflecting the views of the German generals, who for the most part are committed to the idea that if you take out Moscow, force the government out, this war will end.
That's a speech by Timoshenko in November of 1941. The Soviets will not surrender if Moscow falls, just like Russia did not surrender in 1812 against Napoleon.
Okay, radically different positions here. Wow, okay. To begin with, I don't think it was the plan of the French government to surrender after the fall of Paris. On the other hand, it fell and the government collapsed and a new government formed that was willing to make peace. And Stalin, if I remember, it's been a while since I've read some of these books, but Stalin was afraid that there'd be a coup, there'd be a peace, and he actually considered various options for making peace. And I think that taking Moscow and disrupting his government would have probably led him, even if he survived and continued to lead the government, to make a peace, just like Lenin had in 1917, after the revolution. Lenin made peace with the German and Austro-Hungarian armies to gain time to hold it, and Stalin was prepared to sacrifice whatever in order to hold on to power. So yeah, you could expect a peace agreement that would probably be satisfying to Hitler.
Hitler deemed Moscow to be, quote, not very important, and actually wanted to concentrate forces to the south.
Yeah, exactly. And what that reflects is a war of attrition, sort of World War I all over again. And the whole point of what the German military's plan is precisely to avoid a war of attrition, because they don't believe you can win a war of attrition against the Soviet Union or necessarily the British. So
Halder did not want to do that, and subsequently the High Command did not do that, favouring the Moscow Axis. Striking south makes more sense, and not just for the oil. Since the British blockade precluded the importation of additional foodstuffs from outside Europe, Germany faced the bitter prospect, as in 1917-18, of food shortages, hunger and political upheaval. Worryingly, Belgian miners had already gone on strike in the winter of 1940-41 to protest the meagre food supplies, while on the 1st of May 1941 German civilians had to face a drastic reduction in their own rations. The Ukraine...
There's no question about that there was a serious time limit on how long this could be carried, this war could be carried out without creating severe internal disruptions. On the other hand, the whole idea of the German plan to invade the Soviet Union from the military perspective was they got to defeat the Soviets quickly, and It was always going to be down to the wire. Any attempt to consolidate resources or food in the Ukraine only made sense if, and so only if, the war had been waged to a successful conclusion already. At that point, you could grab all the resources you want. You could move south, destroy whatever armies existed. You could move, fly north, wherever. But the bottom line is that wasn't going to defeat the Soviet Union in and of itself. It needed to have a political defeat, and that never happened.
It was a central target as well as the Caucasus, which was also a fertile food production area. On the strategic level, most of the goals were in the south, the Ukraine and the Caucasus.
By the way, you brought up Napoleon at some point, and yeah, that's just irrelevant. Since when Napoleon invaded Russia, the capital was in Leningrad, so taking Moscow was a pointless exercise. And I don't believe that Napoleon was even interested in taking Moscow. He was interested in defeating the Russian army, which kept retreating further and further. But I mean, this is in the era of very limited frontage warfare. I mean, it's not at all like what happened after 1914 with a continuous front that stretched from, literally from the Arctic to the Black Sea. It's a very different situation.
Makes little sense then that Halder and his staff decide to concentrate in the north and centre. The German military leadership, in fact, displayed a woeful lack of understanding of economic factors.
That's just not true. And I'll probably edit in some additional commentary on this, but that's just not true. I mean, it's not that they didn't understand the economics, it's they understood the limitations of their forces, and therefore the economics really didn't matter, because being able to fight a war for the next 5 years wasn't going to happen. And that's what they were therefore fixated on, is a war that they could actually win. In other words, the problem given to them was, how do you defeat the Soviet Union? And the best hope was to destroy the government, cause the disruption in governance, break the army, take the resources. At that point, you're in a position to fight an economic war of attrition. If you don't do the first part, you can't get to the third part.
Training and tradition focused almost exclusively on the operational tactical aspects of planning. The OKH designed a plan based on the lessons of the 1940 French campaign that emphasised a swift, decisive concentric thrust towards the enemy capital, unconcerned by the fact that the economically vital regions lay
in the south. That's a utter misreading of what the point is. Some of the lessons, it's worth keeping in mind, were really poor learning exercises. But yeah, you know what? I'm just going to let this go on because it's, why not? Let's just see where he goes with it.
In the south. It's worth noting that after World War II, Halder is the advisor at the US Army Historical Division and is the central figure influencing the post-war German narrative of the war. He's the guy the other generals are going to, and he is the one who is coming up with the narrative that says Hitler was the cause of all of Germany's blames and mistakes during the war. Halder...
Okay, since we're, as far as I recall, it's like we're still going with Moscow. You can actually see the fight in the directives that are issued. I believe there's Directive 34, that's the one in mid-July, and then there's one at the end of July. And it's interesting because it's an infight within between the government and the military leadership in a system that still had very much the military still had a very Prussian attitude towards the government, and they just wanted to bully Hitler and they needed time to do that. So all of a sudden, they finished Smolensk, and all of a sudden, oh, there's these counterattacks, so we can't move the Panzers south, in the hopes that Hitler will just give up, and that Army Group South would have enough success to satisfy Hitler, which they didn't have. And ultimately, I think it's a meeting with Guderian that's set up, that's meant to convince Hitler of not going south. And if I recall correctly, the real history, unlike what I think Guderian has to say about that meeting, the real history is that basically Guderian folded to Hitler, which is a testament to Hitler's capacity to get people to do what he wants.
And his generals are not going to admit their own mistakes, and when you read the early World War II histories, the ones most people are familiar with because that is the post-war narrative, they show that Moscow was the correct route and Halder was right and Hitler was wrong. Reluctantly, Hitler gave in to the urging of Brauchitsch, Halder and Bock and consented to the resumption of the drive on Moscow, but too late. This quote comes after a few pages of constantly going on about how Hitler made the wrong decision to turn south and how Halder was so right. This is why Guderian is saying how bad the decision to turn from Moscow and help the Army Group South was. Hitler said that the raw materials and agriculture of the Ukraine were vitally necessary for the future prosecution of the war. He spoke once again of the need of neutralizing the Crimea, that Soviet aircraft carrier, for attacking the Romanian oil fields. For the first time, I heard him use the phrase, "My generals know nothing about the economic aspects of war."
Yeah, exactly. It always just boils down to, it's like Hitler wants a war of attrition, and his generals are after a quick victory. And, oddly enough, the generals are right that a quick victory is possible. It's a roll of the dice. It is not a guarantee, but there wasn't a guarantee in France either. So, yeah, wow.
Hitler's words all led up to this. He had given strict orders that the attack on Kiev was to be the immediate strategic objective, and all actions were to be carried out with that in mind. I here saw for the first time a spectacle with which was later to become very familiar.
Yeah, all those present, I think this is the meeting that I referenced earlier. All those present, including Guderian, nodded in agreement, and he basically folded.
All those present nodded in agreement with every sentence that Hitler uttered, while I was left alone with my point of view.
Yeah.
But Guderian is wrong, and is alone in his point of view because, as Hitler says, he doesn't understand the strategic and economic aspects of the war. And the best part is, Halder is actually awarded the Meritorious Civilian Service Award in 1961 for helping the US military in their historical research. So yeah, Halder and his cronies paint a completely biased picture of the war, blame Hitler for bad decisions even though they weren't, show themselves in as good a light as possible even though they in fact made the bad decisions, and then also gets awarded for doing so. But apparently when you try and point this out to people, you get branded a revisionist.
Pretty much because you are a revisionist. But, anyway.
No, the German sources are biased, just like the Soviet sources, and they are twisting the facts to manipulate the way you perceive the war. Anyway, so Halder and the German general's narrative of the war is biased towards the Moscow axis and is painting Hitler as a madman.
Well, yeah, because again, let's put perspective on this. The goal is a quick victory. It is not to fight a war of attrition against the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom. Which I don't think the German generals believed it was winnable. What they needed was to defeat one of them, and more than probably the Soviet Union, because its resources were accessible, while the British resources were pretty much inaccessible. I mean, you know what? It's really unlikely that the German army could get to Canada or to Australia or, heaven forbid, India. No, Hitler was looking for a different kind of war than his generals wanted to fight.
No, going towards Moscow is a terrible decision. So tight were fuel rations that in November 1941, Opel was forced to shut down production at its Brandenburg plant, Germany's largest truck factory, because it lacked the petrol necessary to check the fuel pumps and vehicles coming off the assembly line. A special allocation of 104 cubic meters of fuel had to be arranged by the Wehrmacht's economic office so as to ensure that there was no further interruptions.
Yeah, see, again, I want to point out, I mean, nobody can honestly dispute that that the Germans were short on oil, and they really had some work to do to even come close to balancing their rather meager demands. But that doesn't make planning for a war of attrition sensible. It really doesn't, because you don't have the resources, and in order to secure the resources you have to win a military victory, which ultimately depends on a political decision, a political victory, more so than anything other than a string of military defeats on your opponent.
The German economy is on its last legs.
Again, if the German economy is on its last legs, let's put some perspective on this. The German economy continued to function in 1941, in 1942, in 1943, and you can make a case that by 1944 things have changed. But that's 1944, and that is a long time after this discussion is about what to do is taking place.
The German Wehrmacht is critically short of fuel despite having absolute priority. It runs out of fuel in October and November 1941. The Germans, in fact, reach the Caucasus and take Rostov in 1941, but are thrown back during the Soviet winter counteroffensive. Interestingly, terrible German logistics actually plays into their favour, as Hayward points out, because the backlog of fuel trains ends up clearing in December, and fuel therefore does get to the front, which allows the German army to fight on through the winter months. But essentially, from this point on, the Germans are now not able to wage the war that they had before. They can no longer advance on a broad front like they did during 1941. They would only have enough fuel to supply one German army group. This is why Moscow isn't taken in 1942. Instead, Hitler sends his panzers south. This is his last chance to find oil.
Oh boy. Okay, so I see where this is going. Yeah. Okay. The winter counteroffensive was very significant, the German army was not in a position to conduct an all-out offensive in 1942 as it had in 1941. That's not in question. I don't think that you can really make the case that this is only about oil. That's problematic, to say the least. But there's also the question of what is decided as the next offensive. And the fact is that is why 1942 and the events of 1942 pretty much decide what will happen in the war.